Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Wheeler Centre for this very special event. In a way, two events. On the one hand, we're talking about a singular and valuable contribution to the public conversation that is Sean Kelly's new essay, The Good Fight, and we're going to be talking about that. But we're also talking about a major quarter of a century contribution to Australian culture and our identity that is the quarterly essay, marking 100 quarterly essays with this issue. A big round of applause for 100 quarterly essays. I'm Michael Williams. I'm editor of The Monthly, also published by Schwartz Media, and it makes me particularly proud to be here for this moment. If we're talking about contributions to the culture and to our idea of who we are as a nation, it is important as ever to acknowledge that we're on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and pay our respects to elders past and present, members of that community and any other First Nations community members who might be with us tonight. We acknowledge country in part as an acknowledgement that the moral and legal implication of invasion remains unresolved. 15 years ago, the Wheeler Centre was created, another significant birthday that's being marked this year. Yeah, what a fabulous one. And in those earliest conversations, part of the desire was to create something that would not just stimulate public conversation, not just respond to the present moment, but shape the culture, change the culture, have us think about what was possible intellectually, creatively. And when we were looking at the examples of what existed in Australia already at that point, the shining star, only 10 years old at that time, was the quarterly essay. The quarterly essay that on the page did everything that the Wheeler Centre aspired to do, bring the most intelligent people in our discourse, in our culture, and give them an opportunity at length to talk about the things that needed to be talked about for us to understand what mattered, who we were, and how that would define itself. And so tonight, we're going to celebrate that 25-year legacy, and we're going to look at the latest essay from Sean Kelly. But to kick things off, the man who made the quarterly essay possible, who made the monthly possible, the Saturday paper, so much more, whose contribution to this nation's culture and this city's culture is unparalleled, is the proprietor of the magazine that I am lucky enough to be editor of, and a man whose contribution deserves a big round of applause, Mr. Murray Schwartz.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you. Glasses. Dear friends, thank you all for celebrating with us tonight. You know, when you turn 100, you can allow yourself to stop for a moment and celebrate, and then immediately proceed towards 200. My bit tonight will be short, an entree before the main course. Laura, David, Sean, thank you for being part of this celebration and for your magnificent essays. I've told that Laura and David's essays combined are 10% of all of the quarterly. Was that right? Yeah. Bravo. So I'll be brief, but what I'd like to do is to say a few words about the foundation story of quarterly essay, how it started. The idea did not arrive as an epiphany. It was a solution to a problem that I was grappling with in the late 90s. Anna says that I was looking lost, staring into middle distance for months, which is my way of giving birth. A bit of background, if you'll bear with me. In the early 70s, when we started publishing books, there were barely any Australian-owned publishing houses. They were all British. Not only did they import UK titles, they were also the gatekeepers to American titles. Australia was a literary colony. A very few local books were being published, and many that were of the outback coffee table type. This was at the beginning of the Whitlam years, and the times were changing. A growing sense of national self and government subsidies for book publishing. Over the next couple of decades, the last quarter of the last century, several Australian independent publishers came into existence. The British publishers responded to the threat of losing their stranglehold by publishing an increasing number of Australian authors. Not a bad outcome. But just as the industry seemed to settle into a healthy equilibrium between the Brits and the Aussies, a new colonist arrived on our shores. The huge and powerful American publishing conglomerates saw the opportunity and set up Australian branch offices. They understood that they had to publish a mix of Australian and American titles, and of course they had the financial power to outbid Australian independence. It was in response to this that Quarterly Essay was conceived. I was rightly worried that the best Australian writers would go with the money and the power, and why wouldn't they? I saw a difficult future for Australian-owned book publishers, and I mulled for months trying to think of a solution, a way forward. And then I admit to a small light bulb moment. I needed to invent a book that was not a book. And the answer turned out to be simple: a journal that was a book that was a journal. And so was born Quarterly Essay, the short book living in the body of a journal. Whoever else the publishers published with, they could also write for us. The authors, agents and publishers here tonight will realise publishing in a journal gives writers the freedom to bypass the options clause. And a further unintended outcome, as a journal we could reach a reader via both retail and subscription. Sometimes one comes up with a perfect title for a masthead, and Quarterly Essays is one such. Guy Mirabella created the brilliant design, which has not been tampered with at all for a quarter of a century, and should QE still exist in 2100, I hope it stays the same. Peter Craven, at the time, was editing Blacking's annual Best Australian Essays and Best Australian Stories, and so was a natural choice as the inaugural editor. Robert Mann was the obvious choice to write the first essay. Considered the leading public intellectual in the country, Rob chose one of the most painful injustices of our history, the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their families. The title, In Denial, was perfect for our first QE, as it also applied to so many social and political issues we faced. The first edition was jointly launched by Paul Keating and Louisa O'Donoghue to much fanfare, and we were up and running. Rob Mann has been invaluable to the life of Quarterly Essay. He read nearly every issue in manuscript and always generously gave profound advice and commentary. I thank him, we all thank him. The second issue, Appeasing Jakarta, Australia's complicity in the East Timor tragedy by John Birmingham, contained responses to In Denial, an essential feature of all subsequent QEs. The influence and reach of the publications was highlighted by the wave of positive response and, more importantly, by the chorus of vitriol from the right. Chris Fyke took over the editorship in QE 13 and has commissioned and edited every issue since, and long may that last. Chris is widely regarded as the best non-fiction editor in the country. I can't count the number of his authors, who concur. In no small measure, the longevity and success of Quarterly Essay are a result not only of his editorial skills, but of his intellect and his rare ability to see ahead, which is critical when one needs to commission a year before publication. His record on this has been nothing short of mystery to me. But even Chris couldn't do what he does without the support of the talented and committed people around him, the whole Black Ink team: Caitlin Yates, Sophie Williams, Elizabeth Young, Kirsty Innes-Wills, Joe Rosenberg, Kate Nash, and all the others at Black Ink. Also freelancers Julian Welch and Duncan Blanchford, and of course Anna Lenskit's pitch projects, who do the publicity. In the landmark issue 100, Sean Kelly brilliantly explores whether Labor is still up for the good fight. In 101, Michael Wesley will dig deep into Australia's shallow relations with Asia. And in 102, Anna Goldsworthy will ponder art, culture, and the self in the age of AI, as only she can. The quarterly essay has surely had an impact on Australia, on our politics, our culture, the media, foreign affairs, social issues, and even the economy. It's a publication that challenges its writers to think harder, to think deeper, something they all say hurts. The challenge is to unpack the complex and the hidden, to better understand a leader, a party, a debate, a policy, a phenomenon, to pin down reality, which always seems so effectively to mask itself. The success of QE has outrun my wildest expectations. This, of course, due to the calibre of the contributors, a large proportion of this country's leading writers and thinkers, including, of course, Laura, David, and Sean. The others are on the screen behind me. I hope that this anniversary marks merely the early decades of quarterly essay. I fully expect it to outlive me. Thank you.
Thank you, Maury. And that extraordinary list of names on the screen behind me, several, I think, of those essayists are in the room tonight, and it's wonderful to have you here to mark that occasion. As Maury said, there are a couple of constants when you speak to people who have written a quarterly essay. The first is complaints. Apparently it's the hardest job they've ever done in their lives, every single time, and they say it with a deep sense of wound. But the other constant is their praise for their editor, Chris Fyke, and I'd like to ask him to join us here at the lectern now. Please welcome Chris Fyke.
Good evening. Thank you, Maury. So Maury's given you the history and the concept, so I'll just say a few words on what we've learned along the way. Maury is too modest to really note that quarterly essay is its own thing. It has no obvious parallels overseas, and so in a sense we have been making it up as we go, working out what a quarterly essay can do, learning by doing, it's called, or building the plane while it is in flight. As Michael noted, writers of QE often say what a difficult length it is, anywhere between 20,000 and 40,000 words. Peter Craven called it the longest short form, too short for digression, but too long just to make a couple of points and then bring things to a close. Part of the challenge is to produce something that keeps unfolding for 20,000 plus words, that is both unexpected and a thrill to read. It's such a hard thing to do. Writers say things like, "Why did no one tell me this was going to be so hard?" But luckily they forget, and we can then persuade them to write another one. With the very first essay in the series, we learned that we could publish an extended argument. That meant picking the occasional fight with the Anti-Stolen Generation's Right, or later on with News Corp. Both of those essays written by Rob Mann. The first was called In Denial and the second Bad News. I wish I could say that News Corp behaved with dignity in response, but no. And when Hugh White published his first quarterly essay in 2010, Power Shift, Greg Sheridan, the foreign editor of The Australian, called it, quote, "the single stupidest strategic document ever prepared in Australian history by someone who once had a position of some responsibility in our system." Given how prophetic Hugh's piece was, I invite you to draw your own conclusions. What these essays showed is that really nailing down a case needs space and time with evidence and argument woven together, and that this can be quite thrilling when done well, like seeing a great prosecutor in full flight. We also found out that readers like very different types of essay. There's a big difference between, say, Sebastian Smee on the inner life in the digital age and the late John Martinkus crossing the PNG border to hang out with West Papuan guerrillas. Sometimes we get the best of both worlds, with Don Watson crossing the US border to explore the inner life of Americans experiencing their own kind of civil war. The moral is that the essay is a promiscuous form. It can do many things. It contains multitudes. Another thing that we realised that QE could do well is the brief life. When Annabel Crabb wrote Stop at Nothing, her 2009 profile of Malcolm Turnbull, it became clear that quarterly essay was the perfect form for a timely look at a political leader. Not a cradle to the grave biography, but something more immediate and angled. And that gave rise to some memorable pen portraits, including by Catherine Murphy, Lec Blaine, and one of our speakers tonight, David Marr. David, with his tabloid gifts, gave us Kevin Rudd and his ratfuckers, and Tony Abbott with his punch, and much more besides. David, I should say, has written more QEs than anyone else, which speaks volumes for his character. I thank you, David. Also on stage tonight is Laura Tingle, who has explored big ideas about political culture, such as our changing expectations of government or the institutional amnesia that results when the public service and the media both get hollowed out. As you'll see when you read Sean Kelly's essay, he does both of those things, political culture and political portrait, and more besides. If John Button hadn't already taken the title in Quarterly Essay 6, Sean's essay could perhaps have been called Beyond Belief, What Future for Labor? I think that what I'm trying to say is that quarterly essay is like a long, absorbing conversation, and that it lives because its readers and writers are up for the conversation. They are eager to discover what will come next and what a quarterly essay can do. So I thank all of the essayists for their brilliance and generosity. Many of you are here tonight, and I'm grateful and admiring. It hasn't always been easy or relaxed. Some of the essays have been completed in hospital, as the authors told me only afterwards, some after minor heart attacks. There's been a lot of nagging along the way, mostly by me. Once when it looked like an essay wouldn't happen at all, I rang Mungo McCallum and said that if I happened to need a quarterly essay at short notice, could he write one, and if so, how quickly? Mungo airily said he would need about a week. But now Mungo has gone and the project remains a bit of a high wire act. Like Murray, I want to thank all of the people who have worked on the high wire. The astonishing Black Ink team, particularly Elizabeth Young, who organised much of tonight's celebration, as well as our superb, long-standing freelancers, especially Kirsty Innes-Will and Anna Lenski and Duncan Blashford. I want to thank my wife Bridget for her gorgeous intelligence and her intelligent gorgeousness. In some sense, QE has been my life's work. So tonight, on a work night, I want most of all to thank Maury for making the whole thing possible with his generosity and ingenuity. What a privilege. Now, on with the show.
Oh, what a charmer. I used to think it was on the nose that Chris would introduce himself as the George Clooney of Australian publishing, but I think now maybe he's earned it. So that's okay. I'll bow down to your wishes on that, Chris. So the format for the rest of proceedings is we're going to have a big conversation about Sean's essay, The Good Fight. But before we do, we're going to hear from each of the three essayists who are going to take the stage tonight. And they're going to reflect on their own experiences with the quarterly essay. Chris characteristically graciously said that the fact that David Marr had done 6 essays was a tribute to his generosity. I would say it's a testament to his forgetfulness at how much he didn't enjoy the previous times. But he has written 6 essays. He's had an unerring knack for eulogising people before they know they're dead. And we're very lucky to have the host of Late Night Live and celebrated author and journalist David Marr.
You see, you wait for nearly all your career to be behind you before the editor that you love and regard describes your work as tabloid. Okay, I'll just roll with that because this is a celebratory occasion and not one where certain truths need to be told about the brutality of editors, the quiet brutality. it would be very, very hard to prove in court, but the cruelty of an editor who simply wants to get copy out of you when you are in the midst of a deeply felt creative process, which you know is going to be for his benefit if he will just give you another month. Everybody I've ever written about has come to grief, except Pauline Hanson. I started with the state of free speech under John Howard. Look what happened to him. Power trip. Oh, that was that Kevin Rudd guy. Didn't end well. Political animal. Which one was that? Faction man was Shorten. The Prince. The Prince. That was Pell. I did my best for George Pell, but it wasn't good enough. And the White Queen, Pauline Hanson, who is now getting 18% of the primary vote in this nation. So it's, it's a testament to my work. I am so grateful for these essays. I'm really at heart, I'm a biographer. I love to see the way in which life and character are reflected in work and explain careers. And these essays that I've done were all biographical essays. And the one I suppose I enjoyed the actual making of most was my time with Kevin Rudd. I don't think I would have spent that afternoon in Mackay with a Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, if it hadn't been for the prestige of the quarterly essay. He wanted to be understood in the quarterly essay. And I can still remember us walking along the beach, him and me and the Prime Minister, and two security men discreetly coming up behind, and the sound of the sand crunching under our feet as he turned to me and said, "How is your essay going to begin, David?" And I said to him, "Well, with a quote of yours." "Oh," he said, "and what's that going to be?" And I said, "Those Chinese fuckers have rat-fucked us." And the gorgeous sound of the sand still crunching under our feet as he soundlessly moved on down the beach. Later, he howled me out at the table. God, it was a wonderful night. He was furious with me for having said that with a lot of noise that he hadn't. I said, what's the theme? He said, "What's the theme of this going to be?" And I said, "Well, a lot of energy and a lot of noise with your government, but it hasn't achieved very much." Anyway, it set off one of those one of those it was a nuclear detonation. It was fantastic. And he was furious and he was just quietly tearing me to shreds. And I was sitting there thinking to myself, I know how to end the essay now.
Thank you, David. In volume of essays written, second only to David is Laura Tingle, whose contribution of 4 essays across the life of the quarterly essay has been indelible, I think it's safe to say. She's also the only public intellectual in this country I can think of who my mother has on a tea towel. And my mother won't dry dishes with that tea towel. It's purely ornamental, unlike Laura Tingle. Please welcome.
They've stopped making those tea towels. I'm very sad about that. Look, it's very exciting to be here, I've got to say. It's been a while. They said I should talk about one of my essays. As mentioned, I've written 4. And I'd just like to make a couple of quick reflections on the path travelled with the 4 of them, which I've been looking at again ahead of the evening, and as I was reading Sean's splendid new essay, because of what it tells us about the times and our public debate. It was never intended at the time that they would be a bit of a set. They're all individual projects, but it's interesting to look back at the ground I was trying to cover over a 9-year period between 2011 and 2020. If I squint my eyes a bit, it's almost retrospectively as if there was some grand underlying plan. I looked first at what people expected from government, then at why the institutions that are supposed to deliver it seem not to be working, and then what was happening to the idea of political leadership. Finally, there was a compare and contrast with another very similar country which had confronted similar issues of politics and policy, but taken different paths. An exercise in trying to highlight that there are always choices to be made, and for that matter, unmade. Reviewing the 4 essays and the world they described says a lot about how both the political discussion and the nature of politics have changed. In fact, it's a little bit shocking to me to see the ideas we were wrestling with just over a decade ago and what may have happened to them. For example, Great Expectations was released in 2012 during the height of the political turmoil of the Rudd-Gillard government, and as Tony Abbott's coalition was both turbocharging the culture wars and trying to set up a new political argument about the sense of entitlement and expectations it believed Australian voters had about what governments would do for them. I wrote about an angry nation and a nation that was particularly angry with our politicians. This was just when social media was really starting to take off as a force in the political debate. It was getting shouty, and grievance politics, some suspicion that we might be being ripped off or that someone might be getting preferment, was suddenly everywhere. My argument was that we hadn't really settled on what we now expected from government in the post-deregulation world, or even understood how what it could deliver had changed. The expectation built on the Federation settlement had implicitly been that governments would sort of look after us. That was well and truly gone by 2012. I would argue that in 2025, it's more a case that we would just like to think that governments do us no harm. Rather than hoping governments can do something to improve things, we would just hope, frankly, that they are not shit. In Political Amnesia, 2015, I explored the loss of institutional memory in our government institutions, in executive government and the public service, but also in politics itself. Along the way, I quoted a Russian Prime Minister, Viktor Chernomyrdin, who became notorious for his endearing turns of phrase, which included, whatever organisation we try to create, it always ends up looking like the Communist Party. And my favourite, it has never been like this, and now it is exactly the same again. You'll notice that I've just gone for the jokes in the essay as we're going on. Then came Follow the Leader in 2018, which started off being about the nature of political leadership and about the increasing inanity of personality politics, but in scenes which seem very familiar to those of us living through any event you could name in 2025, the essay got hijacked by Donald Trump and the other strongmen leaders around the globe. The overwhelming story was about the same powerlessness of American institutions to contain Donald Trump that we see now. At the time, though, there was a much more confused debate about whether this was leadership or not. I argued that real leadership should be defined as a capacity to lead a community to accept a change, even if that change is not a change for the better. Instead, discussion of leadership had become one about the machismo of individuals to take on the mob. I quoted a Harvard University scholar who argued that political leadership is not necessarily about having a vision and pursuing it, but about a range of other skills with which to read and push a community. Lyndon Johnson's leadership was his most compelling example. LBJ did not have JFK's gift of inspirational speeches, but he did have a mastery of knowing when to act and when not to, most notably on civil rights for Black Americans. Getting change that had been avoided for 200 years required more than deals on legislation. It meant identifying the challenges facing the nation, regulating the level of distress, counteracting distractions, placing responsibility where it belonged, and protecting voices of leadership in the community. These are some interesting things to consider when we discuss Sean's essay about the future of the Labor Party shortly. And it's interesting to run the Trump method through that prism too. His supporters are certainly not asked to make difficult decisions for starters. It is Trump's many scapegoats who bear the brunt of those decisions. Rather than regulating and controlling the shape of the public discourse, Trump lets it career out of control and provides distractions via social media. He does not corral dissidents, but tries to destroy their credibility. And in his world, dissidents are anyone who dares to call out statements that are untrue. Trump's mastery is not of propaganda, but of destruction of the credibility of information, and that has been so much of the story of 2025. Quarterly Essay, though, now itself an institution, provides us with such a rare opportunity to reflect on these underlying ideas that drive our policy and thinking, and we are so grateful to Morrie and to Chris Fyke for delivering this wonderful vehicle for thought in Australia.
part of the genius of what Chris Fike does with the essays 4 times a year, year in, year out, is not just the selection of topics, but the selection of writers to illuminate those topics and to bring them to life. You know, I personally cannot get enough of being able to hear what Laura Tingle thinks about a thing or David Marr thinks about a thing. Many of the writers up on that list kind of near ubiquitous in terms of being part of our kind of daily political discourse. But at a time when hot takes and kind of immediacy is favoured, there is a real luxury to getting the chance to hear from them in an unfettered fashion, where they can go at length deeply into a topic in a way that is considered and generous and thoughtful. And the names on that board are the people who you most want to hear that from, and Mark Latham. Our third essayist tonight, and the author of the 100th quarterly essay, is Sean Kelly. Anyone who's read Sean's journalism knows that he is one of the most astute observers of our current political circus. He literally wrote the book on Scott Morrison with The Game, but the thing that made that book remarkable was that it wasn't a kind of straight biography. It was almost a piece of kind of literary analysis of the text that is Scott Morrison. And that kind of different sideways way of thinking about things is what makes Sean such a remarkable person to hear from. We're going to be discussing The Good Fight, but please, before we do, welcome Sean Kelly to the lectern.
I just want to start by saying that quarterly essay for me has, for so long, for 25 years, been at the peak of Australian culture, and it is such an honour to be part of that series. It is such an honour to be here with writers like David and Laura. It's an incredible thing, and I'm very grateful to Maury and to Chris for giving me that opportunity, but also to Maury, who is a visionary in making this happen, and to Chris, who is a genius of an editor. That's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that what David didn't mention before is that I was working for Kevin Rudd. I was in Mackay. And so I want to thank David for some of the most unpleasant 24-hour period of my life. I wish I was kidding. I'm going to talk a little bit about where this particular essay came from. Mostly it came from Chris very kindly asking me to do it. But the inspiration came from 2 places. One was that I was driving one day to pick up my son from childcare, and I decided to give my grandfather's wife, Jo, a call. And Jo is a brilliant woman. She was a barrister when there were not that many women becoming barristers. She is almost diametrically opposed to me in her political beliefs and is a political Cassandra. Saw that Kevin Rudd would be torn down by the party before anybody else I know was talking that way, when it sounded crazy, but she ended up right. Anyway, that's all actually irrelevant. Jo asked me what I believed, and I realised talking to her that I didn't have much of an answer. I kind of fumbled around equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome, but I didn't have very much of an answer. And that started me thinking about the nature of belief and what belief is, and whether it's a philosophy that we can articulate, or whether it's a feeling that lives inside us, whether it's the way we respond to something that somebody else says. That was one half of it. And then the other half of it was this other thing that I'd been mulling in around a similar period, I don't think entirely coincidentally, which is that I was watching this Labor government, and it is on the face of it a traditional Labor government in certain respects. You know, Anthony Albanese is a traditional Labor guy, and he likes roads, and he likes Medicare, and he likes wages and workers and focusing on those things. And that sounds very Labor. And yet for 3.5 years, something has been nagging at me. And as I tried to figure out what that perplexing quality was, the best word that I could come up with it was belief. What does this government believe? And for me, most pieces of writing start with a question. And once you've got that question, you start to see like little parts of the answer start scurrying towards you. And so one thing I began to notice after that question was in my head was that Anthony Albanese's rhetoric was often framed in the negative. So he started talking just before the election campaign about doing things the Australian way. and that became progressive patriotism. And that sounds like a doctrine, a positive doctrine of belief. But where it started was we don't want to copy the ideologies of other nations. It was about not being Donald Trump and Australia not becoming more like America. He has that famous phrase, of course, "I like fighting Tories," which is immediately defining yourself by opposition to your enemy. But also, he was asked earlier this year what that phrase means, "I like fighting Tories." And he said it means not giving up the gains that have been made. And so you start to see this, even in his most famous phrase about what Labor stands for at this point in time, not leaving anybody behind, not holding anybody back, it's always framed in the negative. And the really fascinating additional observation tied to that about the Australian way and not giving up the gains that have been made is they're both about preserving Australia as it is. And they might be laudable aims, not becoming more American, not giving up the benefits that Australia already has, but they are essentially conservative in their sentiment. They're about defending the status quo. And then I remember this other thing, which was that in 2023, I'd done an interview with Albanese, and he had said, I'd asked him if it was a centrist government, and he said, "We're Labor." And it's an interesting answer. It kind of rings true, but it's also a little bit circular, where what we believe is Labor things because we're Labor people. And he said, then he said something similar not long ago. He said, "We don't really have factions that are divided by ideology anymore. We don't go in with a left hat or a right hat, we go in with a Labor hat." And what I think is interesting there is actually Labor as a movement, as a party certainly, has always been defined by a particular struggle, been defined by a struggle partly between left and right, which has acted as a broad proxy for a struggle between idealism on one hand and pragmatism on the other. And some people will tell you one of those is the right one, or some people will tell you the other. And I tend to think what Labor is defined by really is the struggle between those two things. And why I think that's really interesting is because I think that's actually a struggle that exists in all of us. I think we all know fundamentally what we think the right thing to do is. We feel it inside ourselves, but we live in the world. We're constrained by the world. And so we don't always do what we know in our hearts we should. And I think there's something of real value seeing a political party up on the national stage dealing with that dilemma. I think it's part of what has allowed centre-left parties, the Labor Party, to talk to vast numbers of people throughout their history. But what I think has begun to happen for various reasons is that we've seen that balance between idealism and pragmatism steadily tilt a little bit more towards pragmatism. And so what I'm trying to grapple with in this essay, where it started from, and I think what it is, I think my own struggle, if you like, is in the essay. Partly it is a struggle to figure out that perplexity, what has been puzzling me, whether it should puzzle me. Partly it is about how Labor has become more pragmatic, why, and it's about what, if anything, has been lost in that transition. And I hope you'll all read it. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Sean. As David and Laura make their way to the stage, that was a terrific kind of summary of the impetus behind this essay. But I've got to say, I am deeply dispirited by this government. And I'm curious to know how much this curiosity, this kind of thread that you're pulling at, comes from a place of disillusionment or whether it just comes from a place of genuine dispassionate curiosity.
You could say it comes from disillusionment, except that's only how I feel half of the time. And it comes from the fact that I swing in an incredibly volatile manner between my opinions of this government. There are days when I think these guys are wasting their time, when I think they have drunk some kind of tiny incrementalist Kool-Aid, and they are going to get to the end of 9 years and look around them and think, what on earth, we've wasted this time. And there are days when I think, there is maybe there's something to this incrementalist argument. There are things they're doing. They may add up over time. We can talk about specifics if you like. And And there is this thing that Anthony Albanese says sometimes, which I do think is striking. He talks about kindness. He talks about kindness not being a weakness, about kindness being an Australian virtue, an Australian value, and about looking after each other. And I think those things are personal to him. And I do think one of the ways that John Howard changed the country was by reflecting a version of Australians to ourselves over a decade and slowly making that more of a reality. And I do think there is the potential for a Prime Minister who wants to talk about kindness instead and caring for each other to drag Australia in that direction. But of course, what Howard also did was matched it with policy. And I think that is what this government has not yet mastered.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by that kindness idea, and I'd like to kind of drill into that a bit further, to think about the extent to which that's a meaningful framework for governing and for policy making. I mean, those quotes you gave, we're not centrist, we're Labor, or it's not a left hat or a right hat, it's a Labor hat. It's kind of some banal shit Edward de Bono nonsense. Like, none of it is actually about belief. And you point this out in the essay, is every time he's asked to articulate kind of concrete substance behind these motherhood statements, it's, the Catholic Church, the Labor Party and the Rabbitohs. It's these sound bites that allow him to present a picture of himself.
Well, look, I think this is interesting. Not every time. If you look through, every interview, which pretty much I have, he does occasionally, really occasionally say something very clear. And you're like, oh, right, that is a clear statement of belief. It is a clearly Labor sentiment. It is something you could probably tie back to Anthony Albanese's entire career. But it comes out rarely. And I think this speaks to something that has happened to centre-left parties across the world, which is that I think they've become essentially embarrassed to say what they want the world to be like. And I think this is tricky because I think, as with anything, that if you act a certain way for long enough, that eventually becomes the truth about you. And if you are embarrassed to say what you believe and you stop saying what you believe, eventually you do get pretty close to forgetting what it is you believe, or at least to using that belief in any sense that actually has an impact in the world. And I write about this in the essay. One of the things that happened to the left, and it's really significant, and we kind of take it for granted now, is that socialism died, is that the USSR collapsed, the Berlin Wall fell, and it wasn't that the Labor Party or the British Labor Party or certainly not the Democrats were ever trying to build some socialist paradise, but they did have this idea that there was some other world that was possible. There was a society that was not exactly like ours that was possible. And then I think with Blair and Clinton accepting the ideologies of Reagan and Thatcher and the collapse of socialism, it really did become impossible to imagine anything else. And that's an issue for all of us, but it is especially an issue for centre-left parties because, Paul Keating has said the only two qualities he thinks are important in political leadership are imagination and courage. And I think centre-left parties, courage is a whole other question, but centre-left parties have lost their imagination. I think that is tied to this embarrassment they have about talking about what they believe. And I think that it means they never articulate it. If you don't articulate something, you will never make it a reality. You will never take the steps towards making it a reality. The beauty of saying that we are socialists, which Gough Whitlam did, his deputy Jim Cairns did, the beauty of saying that is that everything else you do can be measured against that. It acts as a kind of accountability mechanism. Is this getting us close to that? If you represent the working classes, is this actually doing something good for the working classes? But I don't think Labor has that anymore. And that means there isn't really a metric by which to judge them, by which they can judge themselves, except how many elections have we won.
So those twin Keating poles of risk and imagination seem to me to be very useful, in part because the contemporary ALP, it seems to me, don't have a risk appetite for imagination, if that's not too glib a construction. That perhaps when Shorten lost the election where he went in with some policies that required an imaginative leap or required a bit of risk, they got punished so badly that perhaps they learned that was not the path forward. Laura, you touched on the lessons we learn from electoral success and electoral failure and that trajectory. How much does the construction that Sean's come up with resonate with you?
Well, it certainly provokes a lot of, really interesting ideas. I suppose a couple of observations I make is, one of them is when you think about what Keating's, two terms were, they didn't actually have anything to do with ideals either. They were about political pragmatism. Another one is that often the Conservative parties actually define themselves by not being Labor. And a third one would be that this government comes out of a period in which the Conservative parties, despite actually having no real ideology, except that they're not Labor, have managed to dominate the way we talk about politics. The culture wars, all of these things, which Labor seemed so incapable of really fighting off. And so I sort of feel like, yes, Labor doesn't have a particularly idealistic position, but in some ways the last Labor government that really did was Goff's, and I think that's just a function of the sorts of changes that Sean's talking about the collapse of communism, all those things. But, the Hawke-Keating government, at the end of the day, they said, we're trying to sort of, maximise people's wages and things like that, or their real wages, the real wage overhang, my favourite, wage tax deals, all those things. But it wasn't a traditional sort of socialist left idea. So I think, it's interesting, it's made me think a lot about, Sean's essays made me think a lot about this government. And yes, it's incremental, but it is also, you talk about some of the really interesting moments, like when they broke their promise on tax cuts, and the press gallery were all going, it's the end of the world. This is it. That's it. They've lost the election, and a lot of the people in the government were saying that as well. And I was never at all convinced that would be the case, because what were they going to be doing? They were going to instead be saying, we're going to make tax cuts fairer. Now, did they make them even fairer? No, but they made them fairer. And they were shocked by it. And I remember saying to a couple of cabinet ministers, you guys have got no institutional memory of when you could put together a political conundrum and a policy and actually go, if we wrap all of these bits up together, we can actually come out with a cunning plan which delivers on both the politics and on the policy. And that's partly about confidence. And I think what they've really been lacking is confidence. You think about how terrified they were in 2022 to say anything about anything. And I suppose the interesting thing to me is particularly the Prime Minister, in his own sort of quiet way, has grown in confidence this year, before the election, but I don't know what's happened. In fact, a lot of his colleagues don't know what's happened, but he's grown in confidence, and that's changed the way the government works. But it is still, is it a fascinating, transformative government? Not yet.
No one's more confident than the owner of a nice cliffside house. That's the thing that kind of boosted his sense of self. David, do you think this government functions on belief?
Yes. It functions on the belief that by doing nothing much at all, it can become the natural party of government. And this is an idea that Sean addresses in his essay. And I mean, I'm not sure that I've got this right, but I take your essay to be a nuanced and respectful examination of all the reasons, all the sort of decent reasons for a government doing nothing. And then in the last section, you say, but for fuck's sake, look at the majority you've got. Look at how hopeless the opposition is. If you don't achieve something here, it will be to the everlasting shame of the party. Is that kind of more or less in a tabloid, I'm a tabloid thinker in a tabloid sort of form.
No, I think that's reasonable, David, and it's reasonable in a kind of, it's true because there is kind of dialectic there, if you like, which is, as I said before, I'm struggling with the question. I really have not known what to think of them, and I swing back and forth. And then I think though fundamentally where I get to, as you say, where I get to in the end is, in the end you're in government, you get the chance to be in government, you bloody well do something with it. And it feels to me more likely than not right now that they're going to miss their chance.
You also make a great point about incrementalism to do with when action is necessary if you want to create change over time. That it's one thing to say, well, no, we're going to wait until our third term, our fourth term, we're going to do it. But to bed something down to protect its longevity requires doing it early enough to be around afterwards.
Well, exactly. This bed down argument has really, it's annoyed me how seriously it's been taken, because it, as you say, it only works if you do something early. If you're doing something now and they lose power, let's say at the end of their third term, it will only have been there for 3 or 4 years, really, once it's legislated and implemented. There is an exception to this. This point has been made to me since the publication of the essay. The government would make an argument about climate, that climate, they have started to make significant changes, they will build over time. And Anthony Albanese has since the start said this is one of the defining features of his term. And if the Conservatives came in at this point, they would tear that apart.
That's fine. I'd put a counter-argument. Murray Watt. Why do you make him your Environment Minister if you're keen to make change?
I don't have an answer on that, but I will answer the climate point with a very good point that was made to me by a friend recently, which is the thing about incrementalism and hoping that things will get better over time is it's countermanded when you are still approving coal and gas fields that will be operating for decades into the future, because then you're just setting up a bomb for later generations.
You were kinder, I just named a person, but you actually made a policy position. Laura or David, do you have any faith in the idea that a slow-moving government is a wise one?
Look, it's not an ideal, shall we say, but look, I suppose this is why I'm sort of so interested in where the Prime Minister's confidence level is. I mean, I think he's kept a really tight rein on his ministers, which isn't all that great. It isn't always the case that a government has to do everything right at the beginning. I know it's good if you can, but you do have to, as I was talking about with LBJ, you have to seize your moment. Now, and I'm thinking about John Howard here, and a really obvious example of when he turned around and said, oh, actually, we are going to have a GST after all, and the really long lead up. Now, that was in the first term, but it took a really long time for that to happen. But there are other things where he fundamentally changed position on things like Timor-Leste, on Indonesia, on China. I mean, there were really huge changes in his fundamental positioning through the course of his term. Not always great ones, but big ones nonetheless. So the question is, does Anthony Albanese, because it really comes down to him, have that capacity to sort of go, actually, in general, I'm an incrementalist, but now I'm going to, here is the break in the traffic. I always often think about the skipping rope in the playground, where you've two people with a skipping rope and you're waiting for your moment to come in. Does he have that ability to come through? Because, what his style is if you look at foreign policy, they've moved a long way. It's not incredibly spectacular, but they have moved a long way from the absolutely fawning and embarrassing position that we had on the United States, even at the beginning of this year. Dare one say something rude about China or the United States, whatever. I mean, and they are proud of the fact that you don't notice it, I think.
Oh, yeah. Look,
if Labor lived by the betting, let's bed ourselves down first, we wouldn't have Medibank. You know, that was Whitlam going for it. Whitlam came to power and he went for it. And as a result, some of the most fundamentally important changes happened in this country. I'm fascinated by this paradox that the change makers are hated as they are making the changes. And in decades down the track, they are the most admired leaders we ever have. Yes. The admiration for what Whitlam was able to achieve despite his completely chaotic government, what Hawke and Keating were able to achieve, and I think, as Laura sort of suggested, we need to admire also what Howard was able to achieve. The GST was a remarkable change in this country. I fought it like hell at the time. We would be up shit creek without the GST now. And it was an act of great courage. And one of the reasons why Howard loved George Pell all the way to the end was that with all of the Catholic charities were thundering against the GST. And in the last week before that election, George Pell came out and said there are many Catholic attitudes to the GST. He probably saved the government at that election. But the notion that a Labor government would come to power in the extraordinary circumstances of today and not be contemplating fixing some of the fundamental problems of this country, and the fundamental problem which again Sean speaks to in the essay is the extraordinary inequality that is growing in our society. And as that inequality grows, the possibilities of reform diminish. There is no time to bed down some kind of solid footing in order that we can begin things like changing in fundamental ways the tax system of this country.
But isn't the problem really here that it's not a lack of ideology, it's a lack of ideas? I mean, you know, everybody's sort of going, oh shit, housing's terrible and the tax system's not working, but I don't get a great sense that there are the ideas, and this goes back to, you know, what you're saying about the factions as well. I mean, you know, we used to get contested ideas within the party, within the caucus, within the cabinet.
Debate in the party.
We would report what was going on. You know, oh, there's a big shit fight going on in cabinet. Woohoo! And you know, they were serious people, and they had different views. I found an old newspaper clipping of mine from back in, you know.
She's kept everything she's ever written.
It's from last century. But anyway, Peter Walsh, who was the finance minister, was having an argument with Paul Keating on the front page of the newspapers about the company tax system. So, I mean, it's partly about a lack of ideas, I think. And they are already these huge problems and nobody's quite sure exactly what to do about them.
Okay, I think you have to factor into this that Labor is terrified of failure. I think that there is this historic trend for the Labor Party, which I write about, which is that it feels fundamentally insecure. It feels a little bit ashamed of what it is, and that comes from having been treated as illegitimate throughout its history. And I think it's carried that on. And part of the result of that, one of the results is it overlearns when it makes mistakes. So you could see this in the Whitlam celebrations. What I was really stunned by is how much attention was still going to the various ways that Whitlam had governed badly. And you could see this in Albanese's various speeches. He would talk about the achievements, but he would also talk about the lessons learned, the lessons of what not to do. And it seemed amazing to me that a current Labor government would be thinking about that government and thinking, well, there are really things to learn about what not to do. Or you could learn that the Labor government with the largest legacy of any Labor government is perhaps more of a model than a model of not what to do. And I think you see that particularly in its relation to the Rudd-Gillard government, because there was this sense that it tore itself down. This government is terrified of doing what that government sometimes did to its great cost, which is pick fights with big business. It's terrified of the idea of internal dissent. And so I think one of the things when you say, Laura, there are no ideas, I think there are various ideas out there, but the Labor Party has essentially said we're not going to talk about a whole bunch of them because they have judged them politically untenable. So the carbon price, negative gearing, and obviously negative gearing is not going to fix housing supply by itself, but
It does wonders for the revenue.
it does. Indeed, it would do wonders for the revenue. It would address inequality in a not insignificant way, and it still shocks me that this government didn't, in its first term, hold a housing summit and come out of it and announce every single bloody thing they could do, including negative gearing and capital gains tax. And that, I'm being a little bit unfair. I think inflation was a huge break on this government in the first term, and I don't think we can ignore that. But I do think those ideas are there. I think the Labor government is very scared. I do think that Anthony Albanese has more confidence. I think that could go in one of two ways. I think he could do what he did in his first term and treat the second year of this term as the time when he does the big things. I really do think that's a genuine possibility. And the other possibility is that he thinks, well, I told everybody to be cautious in the first term and it worked, and I know what's what, and I will keep stamping on them.
But Sean, if Labor is not willing to, as you say, pick a fight with big business, it can do nothing effective
I agree.
about addressing inequality in this country or addressing the failures of revenue in this country. If they won't do that, if they won't spend any of their immense political capital on addressing those issues, then what are they there for? I mean, what are they there for?
I have no answer to that. I think it's the right question.
But I mean, the thing that ties into all of this is that what you get instead is Albanese trumpeting unity. And even the media follow that same line, is look what a united force the Albanese government are. Look how much they're in lockstep with one another. The denial of exactly the kind of debate, exactly the kind of thrashing out of these things that leads to ideas, that leads to policy positions. For you, Sean, that's all this kind of shame and fear proposition that leads to that? Because surely Albanese knows this.
It is part of it, and then the other part of it, which is tied to that, is this desire to be the natural party of government. How do you become the natural? Well, let's start with the Liberals. Why have the Liberals been the natural party of government? There are lots of reasons. A somewhat simplistic one, but I think one that has some truth in it, is the fact that people are often, in a way, naturally conservative. People are afraid of change, and the other thing is there are a great deal of people with an enormous amount to lose from change, which is why to make change, to go to David's point about change makers being very unpopular at the time, to make change, you have to piss a lot of people off. You have to pick those fights. And I think that. So I've completely lost my train of thought.
Then let me ask you about a word that's come up a couple of times already and is kind of central to your sympathies for the government in this essay, the ways in which you make allowances for them, the idea of political pragmatism. Because I want to know how, to your mind, pragmatism differs from cynicism.
No.
Look, it's such a good question. Do you mean our perception of them, or you mean actually being pragmatic or being cynical, whether the government is pragmatic or whether it's cynical?
I think more the latter than just the perception question, because, to want to be the natural party of government, fine, but if you can't articulate what you want to do with government when you're there, it all becomes just part of moving pieces in a game rather than anything meaningful.
Yeah, look, this I guess it comes back to what I was just saying when I lost my train of thought, which is if you want to be the natural party of government, you are going to end up giving in to those people who do not want change. That is part of what conservatism is all about. It's partly why the sentiments that Albanese expresses so often seem conservative. That is the way to make yourself the natural party of government. And I don't think this government is cynical about that. I think they believe, as people in power always believe, that they are pursuing their beliefs with the level of compromise that is necessary. And so, in a sense, I think I don't know if many political leaders are exactly cynical in that I think they genuinely believe most of the time that the compromises they are making are necessary to achieve what they think is important. I think in a way our perception of that is important because political leaders are always deluding themselves. Political leaders always make more compromises than are necessary, and they always end up in a position where they're hanging on to power at the expense of getting other things done. Always. And that looks worse when they are Labor leaders, I think, because Labor has these other more idealistic expectations on itself and from other people. So I think it is more about us in a way, and I think the danger for this Labor Party is that at some point this term, what people at the moment give them the benefit of the doubt as pragmatism tips into people thinking they are cynical. Actually, we are being treated like a focus group and they are never going to do anything.
But I actually disagree with this for this reason. I remember in the sort of in the first couple of years of the Hawke-Keating government, there was this whole thing about the natural party of government. It was a real mantra. You're old, David. You remember that too?
Yes, I do, vividly.
Yeah, but you know, it was a real thing, and people would write these endless columns about what it meant and everything. But what it meant for Labor then was everybody thinks we're shit at running the budget and the economy, and we have to prove that we're not. And I think that that's a really big theme once again because the coalition has been so potent and effective at mounting the case that Labor is shit at running the economy. I mean, it's just so good at it. People will tell you that and they won't know why they think that. Now, okay, there was the recession, you know, whatever, but most younger people don't remember that. They don't know why they think that Labor's bad at running the economy, but it's just absolutely ingrained. And I think it really, that was that manifestation of it, and I think it's still there. And if you think about, you know, the way the government was so proud of, you know, the savings they'd made in the budget, which were significant in the first couple of years, and without a doubt, the governments that have actually really cut into the size of government spending in the course of the 40 years I've been covering it has been Labor. But you would never know that from the natural, you know, the general discussion. You know, I mean, 1 year when Keating was Treasurer, they cut outlays by 4% of GDP. I mean, it's just like, I mean, I don't know how many trillions of dollars that would be now, but so, I mean, I think that argument is, it's not just about ideas caution, but I do think that they don't really have any ideas to which they're passionately wedded anymore. You know, like negative gearing, these issues. You know, they're always looking for ways to solve the housing issue in innovative ways, but which always involve something, you know, part of the market. Not because they're all driven by the market, but just because it's now sort of felt to be impossible that you can just come in and say, okay, we're going to spend 80 gazillion government dollars to build a lot of houses. You know, nobody's quite sure, one, how you do it, and two, you know, it's not something that, you know, they're sort of going, you know, they're going to die in a ditch over.
But doesn't this come back to the trying things early argument in a way? You know, I did a bit of reading about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and people had different senses of how he'd gone about the New Deal, and obviously we just think about it as this big, immensely active historical period now. But I have seen people make the argument that it was incrementalist, and it was incrementalist because he tried things, and he tried something, and he tried something, and he tried something, and they built, but he tried a lot of things. He tried them very quickly, and often they did fail, and then he'd try something else. And I just... And so, I mean, maybe that does come back to the lack of ideas, but I feel like there's also a lack of willingness to just try things.
Yeah, and say, well, that didn't work.
Yeah. And maybe that comes back to that idea of embarrassment, that sense of we just don't want to be embarrassed by anything. Yeah. We don't want to be...
You know, that thing of saying, we're going to try this and, if it doesn't work, we'll try something else.
Right.
Yeah. No, which
But
is
Sean,
missing.
we've been talking about big things here,
Mm.
but you make a couple of mentions about a small issue in the essay, and I'm glad you wrote about it because I sometimes think I'm the sole person left on earth
I know exactly what you're going to say.
that is obsessed about this. These are small things that mean a lot that this government won't do. Nearly 80% of Australians, when surveyed, believe that something effective must be done to protect gay kids in religious schools. 80%. And to protect gay teachers in religious schools is in the low 70%. And they won't do it. They just fucking won't do it. And yes, the Catholic Church would arc up. But who is going to listen to the Catholic Church and some parts of the Anglican Church wanting a legislative right to punish kids just for being gay, which is what a law of Julia Gillard's allows to be done. I mean, it's an older idea than Julia Gillard's, but she re-legislated it. This is a small thing. It would be over in a fortnight, and they won't do it. And then there are big things they could do where there is agreement on nearly all sides of politics that they should be done. Albanese is really keen, as Gough was all his life, to change the constitution to give 4-year, not 3-year terms. The Liberal Party, absolutely red hot for having 4-year terms. There's consensus there. There are some parties that, not everybody, but this is a consensus point. And it would make an important difference to the way we conduct politics in this country if the terms of our governments were a little bit longer. No, not going to do anything about that. No, that's not on anybody's agenda. It's not just massive things like fixing capital gains tax or beginning to tax inheritance again. Are we the only Western nation that has no taxes at all on inheritance? I mean, even America does, Britain does. Anyway, it's a boondoggle.
No, absolutely, and it's not. But it's not just the leadership, is it? Because gambling ads. You would think the government would act on gambling ads. Everyone wants them to act on gambling ads. And there was a report just last week on the ABC that lots of Labor MPs will say privately that they very much want this changed, but they will not say it publicly, and they will not say it in caucus, which is remarkable, I think. And you just have this incredible lack of debate within Labor at the moment. And I think that's a function of two things. I think that's a function of the fact that you do have an incredibly dominant Prime Minister, especially as of the last election. I wonder if Anthony Albanese is as aware, is sufficiently aware of that dominance, of the way that his caucus obviously feels, as though they can't speak out. And then I think this again comes back to that overlearning issue. And I write about this in the essay, that they think a mistake of the Rudd-Gillard years was disunity, and it was. It did become that way, but it started in a different place. It started with a bunch of MPs who were too cowed to speak back to the Prime Minister, and a cabinet who would not confront him with the problems that they saw developing. And that meant that the problems grew and grew until they were too large to be dealt with rationally, and suddenly there was an explosion. And I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think Labor's going to go crazy the way it did in 2010. But I think it is possible that Labor is making the same mistake in not having vibrant discussions internally as a way of heading off trouble, not necessarily trouble of the leadership type, but trouble of the not being as good a government as it should be type. It needs to have those discussions because on all of these topics, it is remarkable. And as you said, Laura, there were these cabinet debates on the front page of the papers. Paul Keating held a press conference and had a go at John Budden, who held a press conference and had a go at Bob Hawke.
Those were the days.
Sean, I think both those things are true, but the third thing that you outline in the essay really clearly that I'd like to touch on is to do with this idea of Labor's responsibility as a centrist party and the ways in which with socialism off the table, the ways in which they've outsourced ideology and idealism almost to the Greens, that they're the party who can govern. You know, it's the Albanese line about you're about protest and we're about progress. The idea that there's something naive about being led by the things that you want, the things that you believe in, that a pragmatic government doesn't have that indulgence.
Well, yeah, I think there were three things that happened to nudge Labor towards pragmatism. One was the death of socialism as a governing ideal. Then the second was these two things happen at the same time, basically. The Berlin Wall falls and the Greens start to rise as a movement. And what the Greens do is essentially allow that purity, that idealism, to migrate outside the Labor Party. The political scientist Paul Strange has made this point as well before I did. And it's a really significant development, because where this debate between socialism and winning elections, or between idealism and winning elections, used to happen within the Labor Party, suddenly it was happening between the Labor Party and an opposing party. And it meant that Labor didn't have to grapple with the idealism anymore. In fact, it started to treat that idealism as the enemy. Labor could define itself in opposition to the idea of pursuing something purely. And you see, Albanese says this not infrequently. He talks about the Greens being the party of progress, party of protest, and Labor being the party of progress. And there is a legitimate argument there to be had. But it is fascinating that that is the way Labor defines itself now, as, if you like, a party of compromise in order to get things done, which is a subtle but important shift from simply when it used to define itself as a party of government. You can win government but still be torn by idealism in one direction. And I think that has been an incredibly important development. And then the third one, which is just in the last few years, is you have a prime minister from the left wing of his party, from the left wing of the left wing of his party. And as of the last election, you have a caucus dominated by left-wing MPs, nominally left-wing MPs. And where the left has always acted as a brake on those with power in the party, because you are always compromised when you have power, there's no one there to apply that brake anymore. When the left takes power, who is going to be the left in that party? And I think that all those three developments together mean that Labor has become more pragmatist than it used to be, and it doesn't quite have a thing that it's heading towards to hold it to account. And absolutely, as in the Hawke Keating years, it has been very pragmatic at times. And interestingly, I think if you look back at those years now, there is a reasonable argument to be made that many of the things Hawke and Keating did, while arguably valuable at the time, take on quite a conservative neoliberal tint at this particular move.
And they got them through because the opposition backed them,
right,
which says a lot about it.
Yeah.
Can I ask?
Please. We've got Laura Tingle on the stage. You're allowed to interview, sure.
So two things that are interesting out of this, which go into the weeds a bit, and we talk about the party, but I mean the reality of the Albo cabinet is that there is that inner group of which includes Katie Gallagher and Penny Wong and Jim Chalmers and Tony Burke. I think that's right. And then there's everybody else, and it's a really clear distinction between everybody else. And people were getting really pissed off about that before the last election, and I'm not covering it day to day now, so I don't know if they're still pissed off, but as a wild speculation, I think they probably are. So I'm just interested in your perceptions about that. But one thing that we used to be talking about all the time with the coalition was the perpetual obsession with polling. Now, I don't get the sense that that's actually a huge factor, that we're not into fellowship mode with this government as such. They might not have great bravery and they might not have many interesting ideas, but they're not always sort of going, oh, what are the polls said? Or even, what's News Corp saying? But I might be wrong about that. What do you think?
No, I think you're right at a broad level. I think Albanese, even in the first term, has a he has a gravity within himself, if you like. He I can't quite think of the right phrase, but he knows who he is. He has a sense of what his values are, and I don't think he's going to allow. It's really, this is what I struggle with. I don't think he's going to allow polling to drive him in that sense. I think he's kind of a little bit impervious to it, and I'm just repeating myself, but at a broader level, he absolutely has a sense of what he thinks is going to be electorally effective. Arguably, he has a very good sense of that, but what that means, what has meant so far, is shying away from fights like the ones David just outlined. And so I think it's a tricky mix. I don't think he's paying attention so much to the fortnightly polls, but he has a kind of poll in his head, which every politician does. That's part of being in politics. But I think you're right. I don't have a very strong sense, but I have a mild sense that there is some growing frustration. I'd put that word pretty mildly. I'd use a milder word, version of that word, but let's say frustration with the pace of reform. I think there is a slowly growing sense of, well, at the end of this term, we're going to be 2 terms in. I don't want to overstate that. I'm talking about very, very fine signs I'm getting of this, and I'm not incredibly tapped in right now. So there, and I think this is, but to tap out from what is actually happening to what I think will happen. I think this is the really interesting question. I do think Anthony Albanese has his cabinet pretty tightly held. And I wonder if they are going to become increasingly frustrated because some of them are going to want to retire. Certainly at the end of 2 terms, they're going to be thinking, how many more terms have we got? And they're going to want legacies, I think. And, it's hard to know exactly what most of them would point to right now.
I wonder if, Sean, there's another way of looking at this issue of natural party of government. I think we underestimate in this country one of the fundamental ways in which political loyalties are won is by competence, for governments to be competent. And the last Liberal National Party coalitions were staggeringly incompetent. And what I think Albanese wants to establish for Labor is a reputation for competent government. And that's necessarily going to be quite conservative government. But I think it's a more respectable argument than some kind of vain notion that we can become to be thought of as the natural government of the country. Labor has come to power after a notably wild decade of conservative government, and the country is now looking at an opposition that is, bizarrely wild in its views and behaviour. And I think Albanese just wants people to look to Labor as doing the job of providing for them. Now, as you can tell, I think government should be much more than that. But I think that is one of the strong things about Albanese, just to be doing it well, just do this job well.
Before we finish up, and in part because tonight is about celebrating 25 years of the Quarterly Essay, I'd love the 3 of you to reflect on the role media has played in the decline of the Labor Party's bravery and willingness to kind of fight the good fight. How much is that a product of the media environment of the past kind of decade and change?
I mean, I would say there are 2 things. One is you cannot overstate the damage that the Murdoch media did to the Rudd-Gillard government, and you cannot overstate the emotional imprint that period has on all of the ministers who still dominate the cabinet from that period. And there is that, and I don't think the Murdoch press is nearly as influential as it was then. It is absolutely not. But that memory lives within people, and that is hard to shake off. And I think that remains quite important.
Does that mean they are keen now to defy Murdoch, the Murdoch press, or are they still beholden to the Murdoch press?
I think they are still. It's like somebody carrying around a fear that they develop in childhood that they know is completely
but
rational
it's still
now,
there
but it's
and
still
strong.
there. I think it's like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the thing that's been really interesting to me is it feels like the Murdoch, the News Corp thing has sort of subsided really spectacularly since the last election in terms of that, that anxious twitch, but also, the shock jocks, and the way Alan Jones or whoever it was once, Ray Hadley, now obviously they had more of an impact in some ways on the coalition because that was their audience, but you sort of get the sense that Labor has realised that a lot of these audiences for these media products are now people who probably would never vote for them anyway, and aren't as frightened as they were, but it has without a doubt been an extraordinary period in the last 20 years to see how that's played out. And it's still, I think, the impact of Sky After Dark in the regions is still a huge thing in terms of the polity. And of course, just the other media change, which is the fracturing of the media and of the rise of other platforms and the social media. They've all changed, the nature of the discussion.
Can I add one point, which is, I think we don't talk enough about how we've lost rounds reporters who focus just on health or education.
Yes.
And I think that means two things for the Albanese government. It may be that we are all letting them off the hook enormously in a whole bunch of areas because we just don't know what is going on. And it also may be that they're achieving more than we sometimes recognise for exactly the same reason. And that is a huge problem in our public debate.
Yeah, and that's been something that's gradually happened over. It's been one of my hobby horses.
I think there are a couple of other things about changes to the media over the last sort of 20 years. I think we do have to begin to acknowledge that the success of The Guardian in Australia is an important way in which progressives have found a newspaper outlet. This is a strong progressive brand. The launch of it I wrote for it for a while, but the launch of it in Australia has been hugely successful. Partly, of course, because of our love of anything British, but it matters, and that's when Catherine Murphy was writing politics in The Guardian, that was a very powerful voice to an audience that is not likely to vote for the Liberals, but nevertheless gives heart to an audience that is going to vote for the progressive side of things. I think that's important. I think there's also an important development in the ABC because I don't think the ABC is scared of Murdoch anymore. And that uncoupling is going to have really interesting effects down the track.
The third thing, of course, is the quarterly essay.
Oh.
I just make that as a little side
We
note.
don't even have to say that.
You know what? I think we do, because you know what's coming up, David? Christmas is coming up, and subscriptions to the quarterly essay are a good way to make sure you get it 4 times a year, reliably. No, I'm being facetious, but actually the existence of the long form in a space where, you mentioned Catherine Murphy, she's a former quarterly essayist as well. The people who appear in other platforms who are available to us in media elsewhere, to have that space, as I said right up the top, to write 25, 30,000 words on a subject with kind of depth and nuance and sophistication of argument and passion and ideas, that's exhilarating, because that's in stark contrast with the ways in which our politics conducts itself and our daily news cycle conducts itself. And, that I think I am deeply appreciative for, but the contributions from the three of you to that and also to the monthly and the Saturday paper, I'm very grateful to all three of you. And I'd like you to join me in thanking David Marr, Laura Tingle and Sean Kelly. As Maury said up the top, here's to another 25 years of the quarterly essay and the kind of provocations that make us stronger and better as a society. You can subscribe to the quarterly essay. You can buy a copy of Sean's essay up the back of the room. You can also subscribe to the monthly or the Saturday paper, or buy them as gifts for friends this Christmas. They will be wiser and better for it. Thank you all.